got an interview for you today that I'm really excited to share here on the Cross References podcast. I'm going to be chatting with Craig of Awaiting Christ Ministries. Craig is pretty active on the X platform and also has a podcast called Awaiting Christ. And he's also a writer for the gotquestions.org website. I know that's a great resource that a lot of us use as we're Googling questions about the Bible. And you may have seen something written by Craig in the past if you've used that site. And so I'll join that conversation with him in just a minute. But Craig's going to explain to us today what dispensationalism is. It's a word that I've used several times here on the podcast, even though I don't think I've ever given a very good definition for it. Craig is in seminary. I thought he could probably do a better job of that than me. So let's have that conversation with him right after this. Well, hey there to all of our listeners. I'm chatting today with Craig, and he's from down in Texas. He has Awaiting Christ Ministries, and he's going to be chatting with us today about dispensationalism, because I have a few questions on that. And if you're not familiar with Craig, the Awaiting Christ handle on Twitter, but he's a provider of information out there about prophecy, and as we look toward the rapture and see a lot of these signs converging right now. And so, hey, Craig, thanks for joining me here on Cross References to chat with us.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
And so you also write for the Got Questions website, and I'm sure that's a resource that a lot of people listening have heard of. I mean, my mom messages me. She's like, hey, is this Got Questions? This comes up a lot when I'm searching for stuff on Google. And I'm like, yeah, it's a solid place to get some information. But how did you get connected with them and start writing for them?
Well, goodness, it was probably, I want to say it was around 2005 or so. I think the site came online around the year 2000 and whatnot. And I just saw it as a way that with my, shift work that I have been working ever since I can remember, is a good way to still serve and kind of basically utilize the gift that had long been identified by others to me as teaching. And as a little bit of a footnote, I developed my intense love for basic eschatology, or the study of end things, because of that ministry. I decided for some reason one day in the dashboard around 2016, 2017, that I wanted to try to answer difficult questions. And I said, well, we'll see how well this goes. And I got a bunch of end times related questions to answer. And of course, you're having to do deep dives into the scriptures to answer these questions. And that's literally, it got to a point, and it kind of still is, where I'm almost obsessed, but I like to think I'm obsessed in a balanced way. I try to, measure it in terms of not being too terribly fanatical about it, but super excited about, the prospect of the Lord returning very soon for us. And that's pretty much where I developed my intensity with eschatology, because that is a lot of criticism with the ministry that I have there on X, is that, you're too end times focused. So, yeah, that's my story with Got Questions.
Okay. Well, and so I don't think they put bylines on the articles, but I don't know if you see the analytics on their site. But what's your most popular response or answer that you've given on that site? Do you have any idea?
I honestly don't know. With the volunteers, they haven't really shared a whole lot of those statistics. I do find it very interesting, though, that there was one question I answered, and it was basically, when does the rapture happen in relation to the tribulation? And I had, for a time, had the notifications from YouTube turned on for my account. And I noticed that they had a new video uploaded. And as I'm listening to it, and I'm like, these words sound awfully familiar. And I was like, goodness. And so I end up finding the actual article on the site and open up my Word document, because I save all of them. And I'm like, yeah, that's mine.
That's neat.
They don't put our names on it because, ultimately it doesn't matter about us. But there is another one that I answered years ago about basically something to the effect of the Holy Spirit's role in the tribulation. Basically, how does the Holy Spirit operate once the rapture happens? And they actually asked my permission to use that as a blog post, which does bear my name.
Okay.
I mean, that's kind of a roundabout way to answer that, because I really honestly don't know. They don't share that information with us.
Yeah. Okay. Well, cool. Well, so one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, it's not just because you've got the Awaiting Christ handle there on, I still call it Twitter, but yeah, it's X now.
Right.
It's not just because of that. You also have the Awaiting Christ podcast, and I encourage people to check that out, because there's lots of really interesting subjects that you talk about on there that are prophecy related. And as I looked at it, it's the same stuff that I've been talking about here on my show a lot, and things that I get feedback about, questions about, sometimes hate mail about, especially in this topic of dispensationalism. And so let me just confess something to you. I'm a really bad dispensationalist. And the reason I say that, and I've said that here on this podcast before, I identify as one. So I guess I think I technically am one. But I typically never think about dispensations. For a long time, I never even knew what a dispensation was. But anyway, I get told this a lot. Well, you only believe in the rapture because you're a dispensationalist. And I'm like, I don't even know what, for the longest time, I'm like, I don't even know what that means. I never think of things in terms of what dispensation we're in. I feel like I believe in the rapture because I read about it in the Bible. But can you explain for us the concept of what dispensations are, or what dispensationalism is?
Well, I also have to confess that I'm also probably a bad dispensationalist, because I pretty much had that thrown upon me on Twitter. You know, I would basically espouse that, you know, that the Lord was going to bring Israel into repentant belief in Jesus Christ in mass one day. And it was probably going to happen right around the end of the tribulation, or somewhere in that time frame. And there was a pre-tribulational rapture of the church, etc. And everybody's like, well, you're a dispensationalist. And I'd heard the term before, and I'd heard it through the church I had attended. But I honestly had to go and Google it and look it all up and say, oh, okay, yeah. Basically, long story short, in the layman's terms, not necessarily in the theological terms, I guess you could call it, a dispensation is basically like just a period of time, and is a particular way God deals with humanity. So I believe, and I'm such a bad dispensationalist, I don't know the 7 dispensations that are in classical dispensationalism, but you could go through and you can kind of figure it out. You had the dispensation of innocence in the garden. Then you had I believe it's the dispensation of conscience, being ruled by the conscience throughout the earlier parts of Genesis, actually throughout all of Genesis. You even see examples where Abraham, they're entering, I believe it was, if memory serves, it was in Egypt, and he was concerned that they didn't fear God and that they would kill him and take Sarah for themselves. He said, hey, just say you're my sister. And then they were like, oh my goodness, once they found out that it was actually his wife, he's like, you could have brought so much harm upon us. And they were actually more God-fearing than he even realized, and they kicked him out. And I want to say that happened twice. Right. In another kingdom or whatnot that both of them came across. And then obviously you have the dispensation of the law in Exodus and whatnot, and that goes obviously all throughout the rest of the Old Testament. And then you have the dispensation of grace. And then there are 3 other dispensations I can't think of off the top of my head. Pretty much, I believe the tribulation is one, you have the millennium, and then obviously you have the eternal state after that. And
the dispensation of grace, that's what we also call the church age. And I think it's actually called the dispensation of grace in Ephesians. Is that right?
I believe it's Ephesians chapter 3, yes. And yes, you would be correct. This is the church age. Yeah. It'd be the same thing.
Okay. And so the other side of that, I guess, is what's called covenantalism. Is that like the alternative, or maybe the more mainstream view in evangelicalism?
I don't really think it's a mainstream view. From what I understand, there are 3 covenants, and this is generally more or less what Reformed, quote-unquote, Reformed Christians believe. They believe there's the covenant of works, the covenant of grace, and the covenant of, the third one escapes me. I want to say it's redemption, I think, is what it is. Don't quote me on that. And I would be remiss if I speak about it too much more, because I'm not really incredibly familiar with that aspect of I guess you could say, Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
But in my experience, dispensationalism is a lot more popular.
Okay.
So in other words, it's like, again, I don't want to get into too much numbers because there's nothing really official out there.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to say something like 50 to 75% of those who are evangelicals probably could be considered dispensationalists. They may not be, card carrying, so to speak, but they probably hold to those core beliefs.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the normie Christian out there,
like we do.
Right. There might be dispensationalists and not know it, kind of like
right,
how I was.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, what I thought I'd heard about covenantalism is like that they believed there's only one covenant, and that it's like the same all throughout from the Old Testament, I guess from the first covenant made with Abraham all the way up to the New Testament. It's just all the same covenant, and it just keeps getting, I don't know, like upgraded or DLC added to it or something like that. but that God only had the one covenant, and that's the impression I had of covenant. Whereas dispensationalism looked at all these as different covenants, like the Mosaic was different from the Abrahamic covenant, and so that we divide those up. But do I have any of that right?
I'd be remiss to say yes or no, but that does sound pretty much like the framework that I have seen. And I've really only been familiar with these folks on Twitter because, obviously if you just go out and about, you go to church or whatnot, if you have a few church friends that go to different churches, it's like, you're only going to get maybe a handful of different points of view. Whereas in Twitter, it's like you're exposed to hundreds, if not thousands of different points of view, which is where I've come across this more often than not. And that's usually where the biggest part of the objections to what I tend to put out there on Twitter has come from, is from the covenant folks, typically.
Okay. Yeah.
Or the Reformed folks, I guess I should say.
That's where I see a lot of it, in YouTube comments as well. But I'll get a lot of flack from people, and they treat dispensationalism as if it's everything that's wrong with Christianity in the 21st century church. Like we're the source of all the ills in society. And I just wonder why I get that level of hatred about it, when I'm kind of like, even if someone disagrees with the concept of dispensationalism, I feel like there's a lot bigger issues out there when you see the rise of progressivism and all this other stuff that's, the wokeness going on in the churches. But they treat dispensationalism with so much hostility. And why is that?
So what I tend to get is I am told that I am actually preaching that the Jews will be saved simply because they're Jewish. I think that's where the biggest thing comes from. And plus, it's like you have something called hyper-dispensationalism too, which basically stipulates that the Jews have one gospel and the Gentiles have another, which I don't agree with whatsoever. I think it's one gospel with different emphases. In other words, it's like obviously whenever you have whatever writer of any given New Testament book you're talking about, like Matthew, for example, his gospel is very Jewish-centric. So he's going to focus on the fact that Jesus is, in fact, the Davidic king. He even pretty much starts off with a genealogy proving his line, and then goes through and say, for example, whenever Joseph, Mary, and little baby Jesus went down to Egypt to escape the execution order that was put out by Herod the Great, I believe. And then they come back, Matthew then, I believe it's a verse out of Hosea, out of Egypt, I called my son, right? And Matthew puts that towards Jesus, whereas originally, obviously, it was towards actually Israel himself.
Yep.
Obviously, in the mind of God, it had also a greater purpose in the fact that he calls out Jesus. So you have this Jewish-centric book. And then obviously you have a book that is more Gentile-centric, sort of, in the book of Romans, for example. So in the book of Romans, it's more or less pointing to the fact that we're sinful. We have that problem before God that he is holy. God has come down and he has basically fixed that problem by, obviously Jesus living the perfect life, dying on the cross and then rising from the dead, and how all that applies to us. Because if you came to me as a Gentile and said, well, Jesus is the rightful Jewish Davidic king, I would probably go, okay, and how is that relevant to me?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if I went to a Jewish person and said, well, you have this problem of sin, it separates you from God, etc., he would probably say, well, I have the law. No, I'm righteous because I keep the law.
Mm-hmm.
You then have to go, no, Jesus is the Davidic king, and that's why Jesus is relevant to you. At least that's my opinion. And a lot of people, for some reason, when you make that emphasis about the Jewish people again and how God is going to ultimately save them, again, they say, you're basically saying that the Jewish people are going to be saved simply because they're Jewish and they don't have to receive Jesus. Do you understand what they say in the Talmud about Jesus? And they go off on all of this other stuff that the unbelieving Jewish people are supposedly doing, and that is wrong with the world. And if they have that point of view, I have found their view tends to be incredibly anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
They almost seemingly hate the Jewish people.
Uh-huh.
And realistically, it's like, okay, how are they any different from any other group of people in the world who need to be reached to the gospel?
Right.
They're no different from, say, how I was prior to receiving Christ, and somebody, would say that, they should share the gospel with me. Why not, a Jewish person? The only difference is basically their lineage and ancestry.
Mm-hmm.
Another reason why dispensationalism kind of gets a little bit of a flack is because they believe that it's influencing political policy with Washington. And what I mean by that is obviously right now, I think I saw something to the effect of we have 4 out of 11 carrier groups surrounding the area of the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously Iran was threatening to retaliate against Israel for assassinating a Hamas leader in Tehran.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, in essence, it's drawing us into this Middle East war that, in theory, has nothing to do with the United States. And that's their biggest beef with that, is that John Hagee, for example, he's a pretty big dispensationalist, and he sometimes has the ear of certain politicians and could influence their policy-making decisions in Washington. That's another criticism about dispensationalism that I tend to get.
Yeah, I can understand that. But there's what you said about the anti-Semitism, man, especially since October 7th happened last year, people just can't help themselves anymore. I mean, they're really showing what's inside. And what I'm not surprised when I see it from, some of these progressives when they're in the streets marching in favor of Hamas and all that. I think it's despicable, but I'm not surprised when I see it from them. Where I've been shocked is where I see it from within the church, within people who call themselves conservatives or even call themselves Christians, and yet they seem to have no issue putting Jesus as Lord in their bio on Twitter or something. But then just saying some of the most wickedly anti-Semitic things, hateful things about Jewish people, and getting mad at you if you say anything halfway nice about them.
Mm-hmm. And, obviously without pointing too many fingers, I typically tend to see it with those who are Catholic or Reformed. Mm. That's where I've seen it the most, at least on Twitter.
Yeah. I just see it. It just kind of blows me away just to see how much of that was even inside the church. And I don't know, it's just shocking because even if you distrust the nation of Israel for something that you don't like about their government. I mean, whatever someone's reasons are, and maybe there's legitimate things that you could say against the Israeli government, but just the vitriol that people have and how they demonize the Jews. I mean, I think it's just, there has to be something demonic and spiritual behind it, because there's just no logical sense behind some of the things that they say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another thing that they tend to throw out is that they accuse dispensationalists of giving the modern state of Israel carte blanche, basically that everything they do is good.
Uh-huh.
And, you have to counter that with, like, for example, I was born here in the United States of America. I'm an American citizen. As a result, I support my country, like most citizens probably do. And that doesn't mean I support everything it does. As a matter of fact, abortion is probably the biggest example that I could point to. Up until recently, it was the law of the land. and in some states it still is. And obviously within certain political parties in the United States, that's really a hot button. That's almost like the most important topic right now. Mm-hmm. I heavily disagree with it, but I'm still an American and I still support America. Mm-hmm. In the same way, I look at the prophecies in the scriptures, especially obviously Ezekiel 36, Ezekiel 37, Jeremiah 31, Daniel chapter 9, Romans chapter 11. And I see that God will bring the Jewish people to faith in Yeshua/Jesus.
They're still unsaved. They're still in need of a savior. So you're not just rubber stamping anything that they want to do.
Exactly. You know, I can look back and go, yes, that God is going to save them at some point in the future. And because of that, that's why I support them, because I want to support their right to exist. And I mean, even if you want to think about it in terms of secular, from secular point of view, they're the only democracy in the Middle East surrounded by dictatorships.
Right.
So you could go to Israel and basically be free. You know, like, for example, there is, you know, a lot of LGBT folks support the Palestinians. And I've seen videos where the Palestinians, they actually go to the West Bank and Gaza before the war with Hamas, and basically said, you know, hey, do you appreciate their support, or do you know, what do you think of it? And they're like, we reject it. And as a matter of fact, they're an abomination. Whereas in Tel Aviv in Israel, it's been called the gayest city on planet Earth. Right. Which, for some reason, they don't tend to think that. That's not an endorsement per se of that. They do that there, whatnot. Right. I'm just stating a fact, and the fact that folks that don't support Israel right now probably should if they really looked into it. Mm-hmm. But also going back to our original point, and what I was trying to say is, I don't support everything they do, just like I don't support everything Americans do and the American government do. I support them because I believe, A, in their right to exist, and B, that God will en masse save the Jewish people one day, and Jesus will reign from Jerusalem. Yeah, right. I think it's terrible, you know, that they have all these gay pride parades in Tel Aviv and all that, but there's nothing that they're doing there that's not going on here in my own country as well. And exactly. You go out there in the Middle East, you go one country over in any direction, they're probably throwing the gay people off of rooftops over there. So, absolutely. Yeah, that's why I said before, there's no logical reason to hate on Israel like they do. That's why I think there's got to be some spiritual element behind all that. Yeah, nothing else makes sense. I mean, it's clear something a lot deeper than most people can see. And obviously you and I would both know that's Satan and his minions. Yeah. Well, maybe just one more point I'd make here on dispensationalism today. It's not really a question. It's just the stupidest response that I get from people sometimes against dispensationalism is they're going to say, "Oh, you only think that because, you know, dispensationalism was created by John Nelson Darby and Schofield 200 years ago, and you know this is just something that people made up 200 years ago. So it doesn't even go back to the early days of the church." And I'm thinking, at one time Protestantism was only 200 years old. You know, therefore, it doesn't mean that Protestantism was false. And so I don't know. How do you respond whenever people try to tell you that dispensationalism is something that was just made up yesterday? The way that I tend to look at it is, obviously, we had the early church. And then, obviously, you had the era of basically the rise of the Catholic Church around 300-ish AD, around that time frame. And it pretty much reigned supreme all the way up until the Protestant Reformation. So you're talking about a good 1,300 years where the Catholic Church was it. And what they said went, because we didn't have printing presses. The only way you could get a copy of any kind of scriptures was to basically have the scrolls, basically the copies and the scrolls. The printing press didn't come about, I want to say, until the 1500s. Right. So we weren't able, as a matter of fact, the people who started printing Bibles actually, I forget the name of the actual person that was executed, but the Catholic Church actually executed him, basically to where they could, you know, that they didn't want the Bibles put into the hands of the laity. So if you think about that for a moment, you had the early church, and obviously was still within the early church, they were battling heresies. I mean, goodness, they were battling heresies, you know, when the apostles were still alive. That's what pretty much most of our New Testament comes from, or at least half of it is combating error and heresies. And then obviously you have the early church fathers the early church fathers are probably not all going to agree with each other. Mm-hmm. And there is some disagreement as far as I understand. That is actually an area I haven't studied a whole lot of. There are others out there who have. I think Lee Brainerd, who is Soothkeep on X, he's an excellent resource for that kind of thing, what the early church fathers thought. I think Ken Johnson is another guy who has studied a lot about what the early church fathers thought. And then obviously you have the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church is dominated in their teaching and pretty much taught millennialism. Basically, after St. Augustine, if I'm not mistaken, penned the book, The City of God, and took an almost complete allegorical interpretation of a lot of the future scriptures that hadn't been fulfilled yet. And basically tried to say that basically Jesus is reigning now, and he's reigning through the Catholic Church. That's why you will honestly hear a lot of Catholic people say there is no salvation outside the Catholic Church, because church affiliation is the only way you get, or one of the only ways that you can kind of be saved. And what I'm seeing here lately is that you can't even be certain about being saved according to Catholic doctrine. Anyway, you go fast forward to the Protestant Reformation around, the 1600s, if I'm not mistaken, and you have the revival of, say, a lot of the, what we'll call it the Romans-like doctrine, where, salvation by grace through faith, right? That is one that wasn't really taught for almost 1,300 years.
Long time, yeah.
Yeah, so that's an example I look to if people are like, well, this wasn't really hardly ever taught in the church. It was taught here and there, especially with some of the early church fathers. And then you have some of it starting to crop up again in the 17th century. There's a book, Discovering Dispensationalism, I think is the name of the book, where you see dispensationalism, or at least the formation of the ideas of dispensationalism, starting to form before Darby ever got a hold of it. And so the way I liken it is basically it's rediscovering doctrine, because even the reformers still kind of stuck to an amillennial interpretation of say, the book of Revelation, the end times prophecies. So whenever somebody typically tends to say it's like you only believe that because of the Scofield Bible and John Nelson Darby, that tells me they're likely just parroting what they have heard their favorite teachers say as well. And we all do that. We all glean information from each other and other teachers and whatnot. But that tells me they really haven't looked into it a whole lot. And I even did a podcast here recently about basically how I kind of came to a very rudimentary, basic form of dispensationalism just by reading the scriptures all by myself, because that was another thing that was thrown at me, is that you didn't come across this, you didn't form this opinion on your own, you were taught this.
Right.
Which is something I then throw back at them. You're telling me this because of what you've been taught as well, because I believe you're wrong. And when I posted that on X, I must have had, I don't have an exact number, but about 30 to 40 people, it seemed, echoed the exact same thing I did. That the same thing happened with them. So it's like, okay, this isn't just a one-off thing. This is apparently a commonly experienced kind of thing that a lot of people will have with the scriptures, and once especially being led by the Spirit.
Yeah, I received that, accusation. You only believe that because you heard it from John Nelson Darby. And I'm like, who even is John Nelson Darby? I heard that so many times. I finally did an episode just about John Nelson Darby, just to research like who he was and, where his ideas came from. And I found out a lot of the stuff he said, he just got it from people that he had studied, and people had been saying this stuff long before he was around.
Yeah, kind of goes back to what I was saying. And I have never, I really honestly had never heard of John Nelson Darby up until pretty much Twitter. And I have certainly never read anything by him. So to say I got the idea from John Nelson Darby is a little bit, actually it's very erroneous, but then they would say, it's like, well, whoever taught it to you probably studied it, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
It's like, if somebody really is firm, and most human beings are like this, it's not just with, dispensationalism versus, other beliefs that are out there. It's any belief a human being has. Once it gets challenged, most human beings don't like that.
Yeah.
And if they fight back hard.
Well, I always expected that, he just had some kind of dark past or something like that. Like I thought, just because of the accusation it was made like the worst thing in the world you could do is listen to John Nelson Darby. I'm thinking, okay, was he did he come up with this idea of the rapture and then he was an axe murderer or a polygamist or, I'm thinking he had some kind of sordid history. when I looked into the guy, I mean, he was just a guy. There's no scandal about him or anything like that.
Yeah.
So I don't even know, even if I did listen to John Nelson Darby, it's still like, okay, he sounded like a pretty good guy. I don't see what the problem would be right there. But, that's just, like you said, people just repeat what they've heard and they haven't even done their own research.
Yeah, that's been my experience for sure.
Well, maybe just one more thing I'll ask you about today before we wrap it up. But just since I've been talking about Ezekiel a lot on this podcast, I didn't know, with your background in studying theology for so long, if you have any thoughts on the book of Ezekiel itself or dispensationalism, how it shows up here in this book, or I don't know, just any thoughts you might have on Ezekiel the prophet.
So, I mean, the biggest areas of Ezekiel that I've looked into the most is probably the chapters in the latter 30s and the 40s chapters. So like, from say 36 onward. Obviously, when I was first a believer in Jesus Christ, I heard about this whole Gog-Magog thing. Obviously, that's Ezekiel 38 and 39. So you looked into that. And then obviously you kind of start, looking around those chapters, trying to get a little bit of context. And, I would see passages like Ezekiel 36, verses 22 through 38, where he talks about basically he will put a heart of flesh instead of a heart of stone. He will put his spirit within them while they're in the land. And it sounds very New Covenant-like. So I was like, well, wait a minute, that hasn't happened yet. And then you go to Ezekiel 37, and it looks like basically a resurrection of the entire nation, again, with God's Spirit within them while they're living in the land of promise and all this and that. And then obviously 38 and 39. And then it goes into the 40s chapters where it talks about basically that there will be another temple built, and it will actually be a sacrificial temple, which I have to confess that I'm still looking through that and probably am more of a novice than anything. It's more of a fascination because I believe it's probably what's considered to be the millennial temple. And It's curious to me why the Lord would want to have another temple with animal sacrifice if Jesus has been the ultimate sacrifice. Again, that's another criticism of dispensationalism.
Right.
Is that, you just want the old sacrificial system to be put into place. And the way I responded to somebody one time was, if that's what God wants to do, who are you to tell him he can't?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, I mean, if he wants to do that as a memorial kind of thing, then that's his business. It's not your business. You're going to have to get in line if you want to be counted in the kingdom, and if that's what God wants to do. Right.
Well, that's a question that I hope to get into when I get to that part of Ezekiel, because that's this exactly like what you said. That's something I wonder about too. And but I guess if it's a memorial thing, if you think about it, it was also kind of a memorial thing in the Old Testament. It was just pointing toward Jesus. The animal sacrifices didn't save you back then either. So even back then, it wasn't the sacrifice that would save you. It was a signpost to who the ultimate sacrifice was.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But there's a lot about the millennium. So many Christians just really know about what it says in Revelation, but that's just like 1% of what the Bible probably has to say about the millennium. There's so much in those Old Testament prophets. So there's actually a lot more out there. And yeah, as I wrap up the podcast, probably sometime next year, as I'm winding it down and finishing up the book of Ezekiel, I'm really just planning to do a big, extensive study of what the millennium is and just kind of do a broad overview of all of that.
Yeah, that would probably be beneficial to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Just to, have a study that they could go to and figure that out. It's even good for seasoned people to keep abreast with that stuff because, just like athletes do, they go back to the basics, here and there. It's good for us, no matter where you are in your walk with the Lord to, always go back to the basics and see what those things say. Because, you could get rusty, you could forget some things, you could, maybe discover new things.
Yeah. Oh, I bet there's a lot out there to discover that's new. So,
yes.
Yeah. Well, hey, Craig, it's been great to talk to you today. And why don't you tell people before we go, if they want to keep up with you and the ministry work that you're doing? I wasn't sure what your Twitter handle and all that is, or X handle now, but can you let people know about all that?
Yeah. So I'm at probably the most prolific thing that I do is the ministry on X or Twitter. As we all like to say, the handle is Await Christ, so basically without the ing and awaiting. And I'm also on Instagram, YouTube, Spotify, That's pretty much it. I have a Rumble channel as well, but that's basically just kind of as a backup in case I ever said anything that YouTube didn't like.
Yeah.
So, but X is probably where I'm most prolific.
Okay. Well, I do encourage people to check that out, and the Awaiting Christ podcast that is available, I guess, probably wherever anyone gets their podcasts. That's a great place to go and get some great information and just to keep informed about what's going on in the world and how it correlates with Bible prophecy. And appreciate you keeping your finger on the pulse of all that, Craig. So, hey, thanks again for joining us, and maybe we can talk again someday.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.